Forbidden history before humanity's beginning. The rulers of the world before Adam. What if everything you've been told about the beginning was incomplete? What if the majestic opening of Genesis with its sweeping declaration that God created the heavens and the earth wasn't actually describing a pristine first creation, but rather the restoration of something that had already fallen? Today we're diving into one of the most controversial and suppressed topics in theological history. We're going to uncover evidence for rulers who governed our world long before Adam took his first breath. Not angels, not demons, but something far more ancient and terrifying. Primordial sovereigns whose very existence challenges everything mainstream Christianity teaches about creation itself. I'm going to show you biblical evidence that has been hiding in plain sight for thousands of years. Evidence that reveals the true nature of what happened before human history began. And I warn you, once you see this, you'll never read the first chapter of Genesis the same way again. But before we dive into the forbidden archives of prehistory, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered why Genesis 1 verse 2 feels so abrupt? Why does it immediately jump from God creating everything to describing a world that's formless, void, and shrouded in darkness? Why doesn't it feel like the beginning of a story, but rather like we're walking into the aftermath of something catastrophic? The Hebrew text holds secrets that most translations have sanitized. When we examine the original language, a very different picture emerges. A picture of judgment, destruction, and the remnants of a kingdom that once was. Today, I'm going to present you with evidence from the oldest book in the Bible. Evidence that names these forgotten rulers. Evidence that describes their domains, their power, and their ultimate fate. We're going to explore why they had to be removed before humanity could inherit the earth. This isn't speculation or theory. This is documented biblical testimony that has been systematically ignored, marginalized, or explained away by theologians who weren't ready to face its implications. Let's start with the crime scene itself. Genesis 1 verse 2 presents us with a Hebrew phrase that has puzzled scholars for millennia. Thauvabu. Most English translations render this as formless and void or without form and empty. But these sanitized translations miss the devastating weight of the original Hebrew. Thauvabu isn't the language of pristine creation. It's the vocabulary of destruction. It's the same terminology used throughout the Hebrew scriptures to describe lands that have been judged by God. When the prophet Jeremiah wanted to describe the complete desolation that would come upon Judah, he used these exact words. When Isaiah prophesied the utter devastation of Edom, he employed this same phrase. This is the language of aftermath, the signature of divine wrath, the description of a world that has been systematically unmade. But here's what's truly shocking. The Hebrew word became in verse 2 changes everything. The earth didn't start formless and void. According to the text, it became formless and void. Something happened between the creation described in verse 1 and the desolation described in verse 2. Something catastrophic enough to reduce a functioning world to waterlogged chaos. But think about this logically. If God is perfect and his works are perfect, why would he create something initially broken? Why would the first act of an all-powerful creator result in a world shrouded in darkness and covered with chaotic waters? The text itself is telling us that this isn't how it began. We're looking at the ruins of something that once was. We're surveying the wreckage of a kingdom that fell so hard that its very foundations were shattered. But every kingdom has a king. Every throne, even a toppled one, implies a ruler. If the pre-Adamic earth was a fallen kingdom, then who were its sovereigns? Who held dominion over this world before its collapse into tohu vabhu? The answer has been preserved in the most unexpected place. Not in Genesis, which deals with restoration, but in the book of Job, which many scholars believe is the oldest book in the entire biblical canon. Job contains something extraordinary. Detailed dos of two beings who ruled the primordial world. These aren't metaphors. These aren't symbols. These are official records of entities so powerful that God himself uses them as the ultimate examples of his creative might. When God wants to demonstrate his absolute sovereignty to Job, He doesn't point to the stars or the mountains. He points to these two beings. The first dossier opens in Job 40. God speaks to Job from the whirlwind, challenging him to understand the full scope of divine power. And the first piece of evidence he presents is stunning. Behold now Behemoth, which I made along with you. That phrase "along with you" establishes something crucial. This being is a fellow creation, not a divine entity. But what follows elevates it far beyond anything in the natural world. God describes a creature of unimaginable strength. His strength is in his loins and his force is in the muscles of his belly. He moves his tail like a cedar. Stop right there. For centuries, scholars trying to domesticate this description have suggested it might be a hippopotamus or elephant. But this single detail destroys that theory completely. Have you ever seen the tail of a hippopotamus? It's a small flat paddle. An elephant's tail, a thin rope-like appendage. Neither could ever be compared to a cedar tree by any stretch of the imagination. We're talking about the mighty cedars of Lebanon here. Towering giants. Symbols of immense size and strength. This is describing a tail so massive, so powerful that it moves with the weight and presence of a colossal tree trunk. But the description gets even more extraordinary. His bones are like beams of bronze. His ribs like bars of iron. This isn't biological language. This is architectural terminology. We're looking at a being whose very structure defies natural law. And then comes the line that reveals everything. He is the first of the ways of God. The Hebrew here is Rasheth Darkel, which can be translated as the chief of God's works, or the masterpiece of God's ways. This isn't just another animal in creation's menagerie. This is a primordial being. A creature from the first order of creation. A masterpiece from an age that predates our own. The verse concludes with a chilling statement of absolute invincibility. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. No human power. No earthly force can subdue this being. Only its creator holds the authority to judge it. This isn't the description of an animal. This is the profile of a king. The undisputed master of the terrestrial realm in a forgotten age. But Behemoth wasn't alone in ruling the primordial world. In Job 41, God turns his attention from the land to the sea, introducing us to an even more terrifying entity. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook? God asks. And for the next 34 verses, he paints a portrait that will haunt your dreams. This isn't just a large sea creature. This is a living nightmare that makes the mightiest warriors tremble in terror. Let me be absolutely clear. This is not a crocodile. The text dismisses such mundane explanations with divine irony. Listen to this description. Sparks of fire leap from his mouth. Burning lamps go forth. Smoke pours from his nostrils as from a boiling pot over burning reeds. His breath kindles coals and a flame comes from his mouth. This is the classic unmistakable description of a dragon. A fire-breathing serpent of the primordial seas. A creature that mythology remembers but science has forgotten. His invincibility is absolute. Though the sword reaches him, it cannot avail. Nor does spear, dart, or javelin. He regards iron as straw and bronze as rotten wood. Conventional weapons are useless against this entity. But here's what's truly remarkable. His very presence alters reality itself. He makes the deep boil like a pot. He makes the sea like a pot of ointment. He leaves a shining wake behind him. One would think the deep had white hair. This isn't describing a creature moving through water. This is a force of nature that commands the water itself. The text concludes with a statement that should send chills down your spine. He beholds every high thing. He is king over all the children of pride. King. Not monster. Not beast. King. Leviathan is the sovereign ruler of the primordial chaos. The embodiment of the untamed abyss that Genesis calls the deep. The Hebrew word there is ti. The same chaotic waters that covered the earth in its desolate state. The psalmists understood this cosmic reality. In Psalm 74, the writer doesn't describe creation as a peaceful process, but as a violent conquest. You divided the sea by your strength. You broke the heads of the sea serpents in the waters. You broke the heads of Leviathan in pieces. Creation was an act of war. God had to defeat the ruling powers of the chaotic waters before he could establish the boundaries of the New World Order. These weren't random monsters swimming around in prehistoric oceans. These were the established rulers of a primordial kingdom. Behemoth reigned over the land. Leviathan commanded the sea. Together, they were the twin sovereigns of a world that existed before Adam, before the Garden of Eden, before human history began. But their reign came to an end. Their kingdom fell. The world they ruled was judged and reduced to the chaotic wasteland described in Genesis 1 verse 2. Why were they deposed? What caused their downfall? And perhaps most importantly, what happened to them after their kingdom was destroyed? The answers to these questions will revolutionize your understanding of biblical history and reveal why the story of human creation is actually the story of a cosmic restoration. In our next episode, we'll uncover evidence from the Book of Enoch that reveals the ultimate destiny of these deposed rulers and explore how their continued existence serves a purpose in God's eternal plan. But before we continue this journey into forbidden history, I need to ask you something. How has this revelation changed the way you see the opening chapters of Genesis? Does understanding that Adam wasn't the first ruler of Earth, but rather the first human king appointed to govern a reclaimed world, alter your perspective on humanity's purpose and destiny? The evidence doesn't stop with the biblical record. When we venture into the ancient texts that the early church revered, we discover confirmation that these primordial rulers weren't just defeated and forgotten. They were preserved, kept alive for a purpose so profound and terrifying that it spans the entire arc of human history. The Book of Enoch, a text so influential that the Apostle Jude quotes it directly in the New Testament, provides us with shocking details about what happened to Behemoth and Leviathan after their kingdom fell. This isn't some obscure manuscript hidden in a monastery. This was required reading for the community at Qumran, the same people who preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls. In chapter 60 of Enoch, during a vision of the deepest secrets of heaven, the prophet witnesses something that will make your blood run cold. He sees the final disposition of these two cosmic rulers, and what he reveals changes everything. We thought we knew about judgment, preservation, and divine purpose. Enoch writes, "And on that day, two monsters will be separated. One monster, female, whose name is Leviathan, to dwell in the depths of the ocean over the fountains of the waters. And the name of the male is Behemoth, who occupies with his breast a vast wilderness." Did you catch that? They weren't destroyed. They were separated, divided, imprisoned in their respective domains, but kept alive. Leviathan was banished to the deepest parts of the ocean, while Behemoth was confined to the most desolate wilderness regions of the earth. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. Enoch reveals their ultimate purpose. These two monsters are prepared for the great day of the Lord to be given for food. What does this mean? It means that God has been preserving these deposed rulers for over 6,000 years of human history, not out of mercy, but as part of a cosmic plan that will culminate in the final judgment. They are being kept as living trophies of his victory over primordial chaos. Think about the implications. Every time the ocean rages with unexplainable fury, every time the wilderness holds terrors that science can't catalog, we might be witnessing the restrained power of these ancient sovereigns. They're not free to rule, but they're not gone either. They exist in a state of cosmic house arrest, waiting for their final moment on the stage of history. This preservation serves a dual purpose that reveals the intricate wisdom of God's justice. First, they stand as permanent monuments to divine sovereignty. When God wanted to humble Job, he didn't point to distant galaxies or towering mountains. He pointed to these beings and essentially said, "You think you understand power. You can't even comprehend these creatures, let alone control them. But I defeated their entire kingdom. Their continued existence is the ultimate demonstration that human beings are not the measure of all things. There are forces in this universe so ancient and powerful that they predate our entire species. Yet they bow to the same God who numbers the hairs on our heads. Second, they serve as perpetual warnings etched into the fabric of creation itself. They are living proof that rebellion against the divine order, no matter how powerful or established, will ultimately be crushed. They're not just historical footnotes. They're prophetic billboards advertising the fate of all who would dare to challenge heaven's authority. But their story doesn't end in exile. According to the prophetic timeline revealed in Enoch, these ancient rulers have one final role to play in the conclusion of human history. They will be brought forth as evidence in the ultimate courtroom of divine justice, where their defeat will serve as the closing argument in God's case against all rebellion. Now, let me show you how this ancient history completely transforms our understanding of the 6 days of creation. Once you see Genesis through the lens of restoration rather than initial creation, every single day takes on new meaning. When God speaks, "Let there be light on the first day," He's not just igniting the first sunrise. He's pushing back the literal darkness that had engulfed the ruined kingdom. This is spiritual warfare disguised as creation. He's reclaiming territory that had been surrendered to shadow. When he separates the waters above from the waters below on the second day, he's not just forming an atmosphere. He's establishing his dominion over the very realm that Leviathan had ruled. He's drawing new boundaries and declaring that the age of chaotic, untamed waters is finished. When he causes dry land to appear on the third day, he's not just raising continents. He's reclaiming the terrestrial domain that had been Behemoth's kingdom. He's literally taking back the earth. And then comes the most revolutionary act of all. On the 6th day, when God forms Adam from the dust and breathes into him the breath of life, he's not just creating a gardener. He's conducting a coronation ceremony. The commission given to Adam is staggering when you understand it in this context. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. This isn't a job description for a caretaker. This is the installation of a new king. God is appointing a human regent created in his own image to rule over the planet that had been reclaimed from monstrous sovereigns. Adam is being given the throne that Behemoth and Leviathan once occupied. He's being commissioned to establish heaven's government on earth to ensure that the rule of chaos and pride never rises again. The Garden of Eden wasn't just a paradise. It was the new capital city of the restored kingdom. A beachhead of divine order from which Adam was meant to expand his dominion across the entire planet. His role wasn't passive stewardship. It was active conquest through righteous governance. This is why the serpent's temptation in the garden carries such cosmic weight. Satan wasn't just trying to corrupt two human beings. He was attempting to overthrow the newly installed government of earth. He was trying to restore the chaos that God had spent 6 days systematically replacing with order. And tragically, he succeeded. When Adam fell, he didn't just lose personal innocence. He abdicated the throne. He surrendered the dominion that had been wrested from the primordial rulers and handed it back to the forces of darkness. This is why Jesus is called the second Adam. He came not just to save souls, but to reclaim a kingdom. His victory on the cross wasn't just about personal redemption. It was about cosmic restoration. He was taking back the throne that the first Adam had abandoned. But here's what most people miss. The war isn't over. The echoes of the primordial kingdom still reverberate through our world today. The spirit of Behemoth and Leviathan, though restrained, continues to influence human civilization in ways that most people never recognize. Every system built on brute strength, rather than justice, carries the DNA of Behemoth's terrestrial tyranny. Every institution that thrives on chaos, rather than order, reflects Leviathan's aquatic anarchy. The ancient rulers may be imprisoned, but their philosophy of power continues to infect human governments, corporations, and even religious organizations. This is why the book of Revelation describes end-times entities as beasts rising from the sea and the earth. These aren't new creatures. They're the final manifestation of the same primordial spirits that ruled before Adam. The beast from the sea is the heir of Leviathan's legacy. The beast from the earth carries forward Behemoth's terrestrial authority. The final battle described in Revelation isn't between good and evil in abstract terms. It's the culmination of a war that began before human history started. It's the ultimate confrontation between the kingdom of chaos that once ruled this planet and the kingdom of heaven that has been steadily reclaiming it through human history. And when that final battle is won, when the beast and the false prophet are cast into the lake of fire, the ancient prisoners will finally serve their ultimate purpose. Behemoth and Leviathan, preserved for millennia as trophies of divine victory, will become the feast at the wedding supper of the Lamb. Their defeat will be complete. Their kingdoms will never rise again. And the earth that they once ruled in chaos will finally become what it was always meant to be. A realm where heaven's will is done as perfectly as it is in heaven itself. This ancient history isn't just fascinating theology. It's the key to understanding your own purpose and destiny. You weren't born into a neutral world. You were born into a cosmic battlefield where two kingdoms are still contending for ultimate authority. Every choice you make is a vote for one kingdom or the other. Every act of justice pushes back the chaos of the old order. Every moment of worship establishes the reign of the new king. You're not just living your life. You're participating in the greatest restoration project in universal history. The question that haunts every thinking person who encounters this evidence is simple yet profound. If these revelations are true, if the Bible really does contain documentation of Pre-Adamic rulers, why has this knowledge been so systematically suppressed? Why do most Christians today know nothing about Behemoth and Leviathan as anything more than vague metaphors? The answer reveals something disturbing about how religious institutions handle inconvenient truths. For nearly 2,000 years, mainstream theology has been engaged in what can only be described as a cover-up of cosmic proportions. Not because the evidence isn't there, but because the implications are too revolutionary to acknowledge. Think about it from their perspective. If you're running a religious system built on the premise that human beings are the crown of creation, the central focus of God's attention from the very beginning, then discovering that we're actually the third attempt at planetary government becomes problematic. If your entire theological framework depends on Genesis being a pristine first creation rather than a restoration project, then admitting that powerful entities ruled before Adam threatens everything. But the suppression goes deeper than theological comfort. It reaches into the realm of spiritual warfare itself because understanding who ruled before humanity gives us crucial intelligence about who we're still fighting today. The early church understood this. The apostolic fathers, the men who learned directly from those who walked with Jesus, were intimately familiar with these concepts. They read the book of Enoch as scripture. They understood that the spiritual war they were engaged in had roots extending far back before human history began. But as Christianity became institutionalized, as it transformed from a revolutionary movement into a state religion, certain truths became inconvenient. The raw cosmic scope of the biblical narrative was sanitized, domesticated, made palatable for masses who preferred their spirituality comfortable rather than challenging. The result is what we see today. A Christianity that acknowledges spiritual warfare in abstract terms, but has no real understanding of what forces it's actually fighting or where those forces came from. It's like trying to fight a war without knowing who your enemy is or understanding their history and capabilities. But here's what the early believers knew that we've forgotten. The spirits behind the thrones of earthly power today are the same entities that ruled in the primordial age. They may be restrained. They may be imprisoned in certain ways. But their influence continues to permeate human civilization through the systems and structures they inspire. When you see governments that operate purely through intimidation and brute force, you're witnessing the political DNA of Behemoth. When you observe economic systems that thrive on chaos and speculation, creating wealth for a few while drowning the many in uncertainty, you're seeing the financial fingerprints of Leviathan. These aren't metaphors. These are the practical everyday manifestations of spiritual realities that most people never connect. The ancient rulers may not be sitting on visible thrones, but their governing philosophies continue to shape how power operates in our world. This is why Jesus spoke so frequently about kingdoms rather than just personal salvation. He understood that the fundamental conflict wasn't just about individual souls, but about competing systems of government. He knew that establishing the kingdom of heaven on earth meant systematically dismantling the remnants of the kingdom of chaos that had been ruling through human institutions since Adam's fall. Every miracle he performed was an act of governmental authority. When he calmed the storm, he wasn't just demonstrating power over nature. He was showing his dominion over the chaotic forces that Leviathan represents. When he cast out demons, he wasn't just providing therapy. He was evicting the representatives of the old regime. When he fed the 5,000, he wasn't just solving a logistical problem. He was demonstrating that the new kingdom operates on principles of abundance and provision, rather than the scarcity and hoarding that characterizes the systems of this world. And when he died on the cross and rose from the dead, he wasn't just paying for sin. He was publicly stripping the ancient powers of their legal authority over humanity and reclaiming the governmental rights that Adam had surrendered in the garden. But here's what most people miss. That victory, while legally complete, is still being implemented practically. We're living in the transition period between the old kingdom and the new. The ancient powers have been defeated, but not yet removed. The new government has been established, but not yet fully manifested. This is why Paul could write that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against spiritual wickedness in high places. He wasn't talking about random demons floating around causing mischief. He was describing the remnants of an ancient governmental system that still influences human affairs, even though its legal authority has been broken. Understanding this changes everything about how you approach spiritual warfare. Instead of just praying against vague forces of darkness, you begin to recognize specific patterns of operation that trace back to the primordial rulers. You start to see how the spirit of Behemoth manifests in systems that worship raw power, and how the spirit of Leviathan operates through institutions that promote chaos and confusion. More importantly, you begin to understand your role in the great transition that's happening. You're not just trying to get to heaven when you die. You're part of an army that's actively implementing heaven's government on earth. You're helping to complete the restoration project that began in Genesis and will culminate in Revelation. This perspective transforms how you read current events. When you see nations rising and falling, when you watch economic systems collapsing and being rebuilt, when you observe social structures being shaken to their foundations, you're not just witnessing random historical processes. You're watching the systematic replacement of ancient governing principles with kingdom principles. The chaos isn't meaningless. It's birth pangs. The old system is fighting to maintain its grip, while the new system gradually takes hold. And every person who chooses to live by kingdom principles rather than worldly principles is accelerating the transition. But there's something else you need to understand. The ancient texts don't just reveal what happened in the past. They provide a roadmap for what's still to come. The preservation of Behemoth and Leviathan isn't just about demonstrating God's power. It's about preparing for a final confrontation that will settle the question of planetary authority once and for all. The book of Revelation describes this final battle in symbolic language. But the symbols point to literal realities. When it speaks of the beast rising from the sea and the beast rising from the earth, it's describing the final manifestation of the same powers that ruled before Adam. These aren't new entities emerging at the end of history. They're the culmination of forces that have been working throughout human history to restore the old order. The dragon that gives power to these beasts is explicitly identified as the serpent of old, Satan himself. But understanding the Pre-Adamic context reveals something crucial. Satan's rebellion wasn't just about personal pride. It was about governmental authority. He was attempting to establish an alternative kingdom structure, and the primordial rulers were part of that structure. When that structure was judged and overthrown, Satan didn't give up. He's been working throughout human history to rebuild it. Using human institutions and systems as his tools, the end-time scenario described in Revelation is simply the final phase of his restoration project. But here's what gives believers tremendous confidence. We know how the story ends. The ancient powers may make one last attempt to reclaim their throne, but their defeat is already written. The preservation of Behemoth and Leviathan throughout history wasn't to give them another chance to rule. It was to make their final judgment a public spectacle that will settle the question of authority for all eternity. When Jesus returns as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, he won't be coming to establish his kingdom for the first time. He'll be coming to complete the establishment of a kingdom that has been gradually taking hold throughout human history. He'll be finishing the restoration project that began in Genesis. And those ancient rulers who thought they could maintain their grip is no power in what Behemoth and Leviathan learned long ago. They're on power. They'll discover authority of the Creator. The heaven or earth or under the earth that can stand against the evidence is overwhelming. The documentation is clear. The implications are staggering. Humanity wasn't the first attempt at planetary government, but we may very well be the last. The kingdom that was established through Adam, lost through his fall, and reclaimed through Christ's victory, is destined to fill the earth as the waters cover the sea. The ancient rulers had their day. Their kingdoms rose and fell. Their power was broken and their dominion stripped away. But the kingdom that replaces them will never end. It will never be overthrown. It will never know defeat. And you, if you've aligned yourself with the true King, are part of that eternal kingdom. You're not just a citizen of a spiritual realm that exists somewhere else. You're an agent of governmental transformation, working to implement heaven's authority in the very realm that the ancient powers once ruled. The war that began before human history will end with human history. And when it does, the question of who rules this planet will finally be settled forever. This brings us to a revelation that will shake you to your core. The memory of these primordial rulers didn't simply vanish when their kingdom fell. Instead, it fractured and scattered across human consciousness like shattered glass, each piece reflecting a distorted image of the truth. Walk into any museum of ancient civilizations and you'll see them everywhere. Not as historical records, but as mythological echoes. The Babylonians told stories of Marduk battling the sea dragon Tiamat. The Canaanites spoke of Baal defeating the serpent Latan. The Egyptians feared Apep, the great serpent of chaos that threatened to devour the sun god Ra. These weren't random fairy tales invented by primitive minds. They were fractured memories of actual events passed down through generations until truth became legend and legend became myth. Every culture on Earth has some version of the Dragon Slayer story, because every culture carries genetic memory of the day God crushed the heads of Leviathan. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. These myths didn't preserve just the memory of defeat. They preserved the memory of power. Ancient peoples didn't just fear these entities. They worshipped them. They built temples to dragons. They offered sacrifices to sea monsters. They created entire religions around the very forces that God had overthrown. Why would they do this? Because the human heart, corrupted by the fall, naturally gravitates toward the kingdom of chaos, rather than the kingdom of order. We're drawn to power without accountability, strength without wisdom, authority without love. The spirit of the ancient rulers didn't die when their physical kingdom was destroyed. It lived on in every human system that chose might overwrite. This is why the dragon appears not just in ancient mythology, but in the final book of the Bible. Revelation pulls back the veil on spiritual reality and shows us that the same entities that ruled before Adam are still operating behind the scenes of human history. The great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns isn't a new creature appearing at the end times. It's the ancient serpent, the devil and Satan finally revealing his true form as the power behind the primordial throne. And when he gives his authority to the beast that rises from the sea, we're witnessing the final attempt to restore the original kingdom structure. The beast from the sea carries the DNA of Leviathan's chaotic rule. The beast from the earth manifests the territorial dominance that once belonged to Behemoth. But notice something crucial in the prophetic timeline. These beasts don't appear until the very end of human history. Why the delay? Why didn't Satan simply restore his ancient allies immediately after the fall? Because God's plan required human participation in the restoration process. The defeat of the primordial rulers wasn't just about removing bad leadership. It was about establishing a new form of government, based on partnership between heaven and earth. Adam was supposed to be God's vice-regent, exercising divine authority through human agency. When Adam fell, he didn't just lose personal innocence. He surrendered the governmental mandate that had been purchased at such a high cost. He handed back to the forces of darkness the very authority that God had wrested from them through cosmic warfare. But God didn't abandon the project. Instead, He initiated a long-term recovery plan that would take thousands of years to complete. Every patriarch, every judge, every king of Israel was a partial restoration of the original mandate. Every prophet who spoke God's word was exercising the authority that Adam had surrendered. And then came Jesus, the second Adam, the one who would finally and completely reclaim the throne that the first Adam had abdicated. But here's what most people miss about the incarnation. Jesus didn't come just to die for our sins. He came to live the life that Adam should have lived. He came to exercise the dominion that Adam should have exercised. He came to prove that human beings, when properly connected to divine authority, could indeed govern the earth according to heaven's principles. Every miracle was a governmental act. When he multiplied loaves and fishes, he was demonstrating that the new kingdom operates on abundance rather than scarcity. When he healed the sick, he was showing that heaven's government brings wholeness rather than brokenness. When he raised the dead, he was proving that the authority of the new kingdom extends even over death itself. And when he calmed the storm with just his words, he was doing something that should make us tremble with awe. He was exercising dominion over the very realm that had belonged to Leviathan. He was demonstrating that the chaotic waters that had once been ruled by a monstrous serpent now bowed to the voice of their true king. The disciples were terrified, not just because the storm stopped, but because they suddenly realized who was in their boat. This wasn't just their teacher. This was the one who held authority over forces they couldn't even comprehend. But the ultimate governmental act was the cross itself. When Jesus died and rose again, he wasn't just paying the penalty for sin. He was publicly stripping the ancient powers of their legal right to rule. He was reclaiming the governmental authority that Adam had lost and establishing it on an unshakable foundation. The resurrection wasn't just about conquering death. It was about proving that the new kingdom is indestructible. The ancient powers had done their worst. And it wasn't enough. They had thrown everything they had at the new king, and he had emerged victorious. This is why Paul could write that Jesus led captivity captive when he ascended. He wasn't just taking believers to heaven. He was parading the defeated powers before all creation, demonstrating that their authority was forever broken. But here's where the story takes a turn that most believers don't understand. The victory was complete, but the implementation is ongoing. We're living in the transition period between the defeat of the old kingdom and the full manifestation of the new. Think of it like a conquered nation where the old government has been overthrown. But the new administration is still being established. There are pockets of resistance. There are loyalists to the old regime who refuse to acknowledge the new authority. There are systems and structures that were built under the old government that need to be systematically replaced. This is why Jesus taught his disciples to pray, "Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." The kingdom had come in his person, but it needed to be established in every sphere of human activity. It needed to infiltrate governments, economies, educational systems, media, arts, sciences, and families. Every believer who lives according to kingdom principles, rather than worldly principles, is helping to implement the new government. Every act of love pushes back the chaos of the old order. Every moment of worship establishes the reign of the true king. But the ancient powers haven't given up. They know their time is short. And they're making one final desperate attempt to restore their kingdom. This is what we're witnessing in our generation. The systematic breakdown of order. The rise of chaos in every sphere of society. The increasing boldness of systems that operate purely through intimidation and manipulation. These aren't random historical developments. This is the death throes of an ancient governmental system that knows it's been defeated, but refuses to surrender quietly. The good news is that we know how this story ends. The ancient rulers may make one last stand. But their defeat is already written in prophecy. When Jesus returns, it won't be as a suffering servant. It will be as a conquering king. And every knee will bow to the authority that was purchased at Calvary. The primordial powers that once ruled this planet will finally acknowledge what they've known all along but refused to admit. They were never the true kings. They were usurpers, rebels, pretenders to a throne that belonged to another. And when the new heaven and new earth are established, when the sea is no more and the wilderness is transformed into a garden, the very domains where Behemoth and Leviathan were imprisoned will be redeemed. The chaos they represented will be forever replaced by the perfect order of divine love. This ancient history isn't just fascinating theology. It's the key to understanding your identity and purpose. You weren't born into a neutral world. You were born into a cosmic transition. A moment in universal history when one kingdom is giving way to another. Every choice you make is a vote for one kingdom or the other. Every act of integrity pushes back the corruption of the old system. Every moment of worship establishes the reality of the new government. You're not just living your life. You're participating in the greatest restoration project in the history of the universe. You're helping to complete the work that began before Adam drew his first breath, and will culminate when the last enemy is put under Christ's feet. The ancient rulers had their day. Their kingdoms rose and fell. Their power was broken and their dominion stripped away. But you, if you've aligned yourself with the true king, are part of a kingdom that will never end, never be overthrown, never know defeat. The war that began in the primordial age will end with your generation. And when it does, the question of who rules this planet will be settled forever. The throne that was usurped will be restored. The government that was corrupted will be purified. The kingdom that was lost will be reclaimed. And every human being who chose to serve the true king rather than the false rulers will reign with him in the world that the ancient powers could never build. A world where justice flows like a river. Where peace has no end. Where love is the only law and where the glory of God covers the earth as the waters cover the sea. This is your inheritance. This is your destiny. This is why you were born for such a time as this. The implications of this revelation extend far beyond ancient history. They reach into the very fabric of reality itself, challenging everything you thought you knew about the nature of existence. Because if these primordial rulers were real, if they governed a world before Adam, then we must ask the most unsettling question of all. What other secrets has history buried? Consider this carefully. If mainstream theology can systematically ignore or explain away clear biblical evidence of pre-Adamic rulers, what else might they have sanitized? If the opening chapters of Genesis have been misunderstood for centuries, what other foundational truths have been lost or deliberately obscured? The answer should terrify every serious student of Scripture. Because the suppression of this knowledge wasn't accidental. It was strategic. There are forces at work that benefit from keeping humanity ignorant of our true history and cosmic significance. Think about it from their perspective. If people understood that we're living in a reclaimed kingdom rather than an original creation, they might start asking uncomfortable questions about who's really running things. Now, if they realize that ancient powers are still influencing human systems from behind the scenes, they might begin to recognize those influences in contemporary institutions. But there's something even more disturbing that emerges when you trace this thread to its logical conclusion. The preservation of Behemoth and Leviathan wasn't just about demonstrating divine power or serving as warnings. These entities were kept alive because they still have a role to play in the final act of human history. Remember what Enoch revealed about their ultimate purpose. They're being prepared for the great day of judgment to be given as food. But food for whom? The text suggests it's for the righteous. For those who remained faithful throughout the great transition. But there's a deeper layer here that most people miss. In ancient Near Eastern cultures, consuming the flesh of a defeated enemy wasn't just about sustenance. It was about completely absorbing their power and authority. It was then never rise again. What if the final ultimate act of conquest? Ensuring that the defeated caste isn't metaphorical. What if the complete integration of these ancient powers into the redeemed creation is the final step in establishing eternal order? What if their consumption by the faithful represents the total transformation of chaos into perfect harmony? This interpretation aligns with something profound that Paul wrote about the nature of spiritual warfare. He didn't just say that Christ defeated the powers and principalities. He said that we would judge angels, that fallen spiritual entities would ultimately be subject to human authority exercised through divine connection. This is true. Then the preservation of Behemoth and Leviathan serves an even more extraordinary purpose. They're not just trophies of victory. They're training partners. Living examples of the kind of cosmic authority that redeemed humanity will eventually wield. But let me show you where this gets truly mind-bending. The description of these entities in Job doesn't just reveal their past power. It provides a blueprint for understanding the full scope of authority that was always intended for human beings. When God describes Behemoth's strength in his loins and the force in his muscles, he's not just talking about physical power. In Hebrew thought, the loins represent the seat of generative force, the ability to create and reproduce. Behemoth's strength wasn't just in his ability to destroy. It was in his capacity to generate reality according to his will. When Leviathan is described as making the deep boil like a pot, we're seeing something that transcends mere physical interaction with water. This is a being whose very presence alters the fundamental properties of matter. He doesn't just move capabilities weren't unique to these primordial rulers through his environment. He transforms it. These built into the original design of creation itself. They were expressions of the kind of authority that was the power to speak reality into existence, to transform chaos into order, to exercise dominion over the very fabric of the physical universe. This was the inheritance that Adam was supposed to claim. This was the authority he was meant to grow into as he matured in his relationship with his Creator. The commission to subdue the earth wasn't about environmental management. It was about learning to exercise the same kind of reality-shaping power that had been demonstrated by the defeated rulers. But Adam never reached that level of development. He fell before he could fully understand what he was inheriting. The authority that should have been his was never fully realized in the first human kingdom. This is why Jesus had to come not just as Savior but as the prototype of what humanity was always meant to become. Every miracle he performed was a demonstration of the kind of power that was built into the original human design. Walking on water wasn't a supernatural anomaly. It was human authority functioning as originally intended. Multiplying loaves and fishes wasn't magic. It was the exercise of generative power that should have been natural to beings created in God's image. Raising the dead wasn't a divine exception to natural law. It was the restoration of authority over life and death that was part of humanity's original mandate. The disciples' amazement at these demonstrations reveals how far the human race had fallen from its intended state. What should have been normal human capability operating at full potential had become so foreign that it seemed miraculous. But here's what changes everything about how you understand your own potential and destiny. The resurrection didn't just secure salvation for believers. It restored the original blueprint for human authority. It reopened the pathway to the kind of dominion that Adam was meant to exercise but never achieved. This is why Paul could write about believers being seated with Christ in heavenly places. It wasn't just about positional truth or future reality. It was about present access to the kind of governmental authority that transcends physical limitations. This is why Jesus told his followers that they would do greater works than he had done. Not because they would surpass him in power, but because they would have access to the same authority he had demonstrated, multiplied across millions of believers operating simultaneously throughout history. The early church understood this. The Book of Acts records believers exercising exactly the kind of reality-shaping authority that characterized Jesus' ministry. They healed the sick, raised the dead, and transformed entire communities through the demonstration of kingdom power. But something happened to that understanding. Over the centuries, the institutional church gradually shifted from expecting supernatural demonstration to merely hoping for it. From exercising authority to simply preaching about it. From transforming society to merely criticizing it. Why did this shift occur? Because the revelation of humanity's true destiny was too dangerous to the existing power structures. Religious and political institutions that derived their authority from human systems couldn't afford to have their congregants and citizens understanding their true identity and capability. It was safer to teach people that they were merely sinners saved by grace than to reveal that they were actually displaced royalty being restored to their rightful throne. It was more manageable to focus on getting to heaven after death than to emphasize bringing heaven to earth in the present. But the ancient texts don't allow for such diminished expectations. The evidence is overwhelming that human beings were designed to exercise the same kind of cosmic authority that the primordial rulers once wielded, but channeled through relationship with the Creator rather than independent rebellion. The difference between the ancient kingdom and the restored kingdom isn't in the scope of power available. It's in the source and purpose of that power. Behemoth and Leviathan exercised authority for their own glory and according to their own will. Redeemed humanity exercises the same level of authority for God's glory and according to His will. This distinction makes all the difference between chaos and order, between tyranny and freedom, between destruction and creativity. The power itself is neutral. The question is always who wields it and for what purpose. Understanding this transforms how you read the prophetic descriptions of the end times. The restoration of all things isn't just about repairing damage caused by sin. It's about humanity finally reaching the maturity level that was always intended from the beginning. When Isaiah prophesied that the knowledge of the glory of the Lord would cover the earth as the waters cover the sea, he wasn't describing divine propaganda flooding the planet. He was seeing a time when human beings would finally operate at their designed capacity, demonstrating God's nature and authority through their very existence. When Revelation describes the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven to earth, it's not depicting an architectural project. It's revealing the moment when heavenly government becomes fully manifest through human agency. When the partnership between divine authority and human creativity finally produces the kind of civilization that was always intended. The ancient rulers couldn't build such a civilization because their power was self-serving. They could dominate and control, but they couldn't create genuine order or lasting beauty. Their kingdoms always contained the seeds of their own destruction because they were based on taking rather than giving. But human beings, when properly connected to divine love, can exercise unlimited power without corruption because their joy comes from blessing others rather than exalting themselves. They can reshape reality itself while maintaining perfect harmony because their creativity flows from relationship rather than rebellion. This is why the defeat of Behemoth and Leviathan was necessary before the human experiment could begin. Not because their power was inherently evil, but because their independence from divine love made them incapable of using that power constructively. And this is why their preservation until the end times serves such a crucial purpose. When they finally emerge for their last stand against the kingdom of heaven, they won't be facing the same kind of opponents they once knew. They'll be confronting human beings who have finally matured into their original design. The final battle won't be between God and the ancient powers. It will be between redeemed humanity operating in divine authority and the forces that once ruled through fear and intimidation. It will be the ultimate demonstration that love is stronger than hate, that creativity is more powerful than destruction, and that beings who serve others are infinitely more capable than those who serve only themselves. When that confrontation is complete, when the ancient rulers are finally consumed by those they once sought to dominate, the circle will be closed. The authority they stole will be fully restored. The kingdom they corrupted will be completely purified. The dominion they abused will be permanently established in hands that will never let it fall again. But here's what you need to understand about your place in this cosmic drama. You're not just waiting for this restoration to happen someday. You're actively participating in making it happen right now. Every time you choose love over fear, order over chaos, service over self-interest, you're exercising the same kind of authority that will ultimately triumph over the ancient powers. Every act of healing pushes back the influence of the old kingdom. Every moment of creative expression demonstrates the superiority of the new government. Every choice to bless rather than curse accelerates the transition from the age of chaos to the age of perfect order. The evidence stands before you like an ancient monument. Impossible to ignore and too significant to dismiss. We've uncovered the forbidden archives of prehistory, decoded the official records of entities that ruled before human breath ever filled mortal lungs, and revealed why their defeat was necessary before your story could even begin. You now understand that Genesis isn't describing creation from nothing, but restoration from chaos. That Adam wasn't the first king of Earth, but the first human appointed to rule a reclaimed realm. That the war you're living through today has roots extending back before human history began. The primordial sovereigns Behemoth and Leviathan may be imprisoned, but their final act in the cosmic drama is yet to come. And when it unfolds, you'll witness the ultimate vindication of divine authority over every power that ever dared to challenge heaven's throne. This knowledge changes everything about your purpose and identity. You're not just living your life. You're participating in the greatest restoration project in universal history, helping to complete what began before Adam's first breath, and will culminate when the last enemy falls beneath the feet of the true king.